Hi, everyone. I'm Josette. As Chris has said, what an incredible symposium this has been at a very key moment in time, and our biggest ever. We had more than 1,000 people registered and participating in the events, but I'm very particularly excited about this conversation with, with Marc Morial, who is the CEO of the National Urban League, one of the most significant civil rights and justice organizations, and founded well over 100 years ago in the United States. I'm excited for a few reasons. First, this is an exceptional human being. He was an overachiever from the beginning. He had achieved a national record for football field goal. He was a founder of a successful business, champion orator, and receiving awards. This was all before he was 15 years old. And it just kept going. So, graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown Law, in the state Senate, and one of the youngest mayors ever elected in the United States as mayor of New Orleans, and second generation. So I'd love to hear that story, Marc. He's now, and I think when you left office, you had 70% approval rating. You did many transformational things in New Orleans. Now president and CEO of the National Urban League. I'm also excited because I've been a lifelong member of the National Urban League for many decades and was on the Washington Advisory Board years ago when I worked with Jack Kemp, and we were doing work on how to empower and transform the inner cities of America together. And so I think, and I will just say also, this is a time when we need vision. And Marc is the author of a book called the Gumbo Coalition. So in addition to his leadership at the National Urban League, he also has worked for positive change in the world and laid out the leadership principles that are needed in a diverse world. So I think we have lost Marc for a moment. And we've got him back. Okay, Marc. Well, Marc, I think everyone can hear you. So let's go. So, Marc, if I could just start this off, I've just said a lot of good things about you. I don't know if you could hear it. I'm going to start off by quoting a very accomplished woman named Michelle Miller, who is the host of CBS Saturday Morning, who did a very emotional personal testimony on these issues after the killing of George Floyd. And one of the things she said is this could be the moment that changes everything. Michelle happens to be your partner in life, but it was such a beautiful testimony and essay. Is this the tipping point? Is this the moment? You've been working on these issues for your entire life.
Look, first of all, thanks to the Asian Society. Thanks to you. Appreciate the chance to be part of this conversation. And thanks to all who joined today. I feel that this is a different moment. I feel that the spontaneity of it, the organic nature of the protests, the way in which people at the highest levels in American life have responded make it different. It doesn't seem as though this is similar to what we've seen in the past. It's my hope and it's my prayer that this moment becomes a movement, and it becomes a movement for significant positive change, structural change, a true commitment to dismantle structural inequality and racism and all of its vestiges, which will take the work of many for many years, but the concerted steps that we can take now. We can take many concerted steps. So it feels different. I had the chance twice to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington for 2 days of protest. Had an opportunity to participate and speak at a protest rally in Philadelphia on Sunday, and also went to another protest rally with my teenage daughter, not too far from where we live, just outside of New York. And the breadth of the crowd, the diversity of the crowd, the mix of the crowd, the fire and enthusiasm in a very positive way of the crowds that I saw meant it felt and seem different than what I've seen in the past. Most marches and protests, there have been spontaneous marches and protests, but there have also been, many times organized marches and organized protests, which are very important and have been more common than spontaneous marches and spontaneous protests. And this outrage has touched every corner of this nation and has touched many, many nations on earth. Certainly the United Kingdom and France, London and Paris, we've seen street mobilizations and protests. New Zealand and Australia, we've seen street mobilizations and efforts to support this moment here in the United States.
Let me ask you this. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm done.
No, your book, The Gumbo Coalition. It's a reference to New Orleans, but you have really been a proponent of leadership and the power of leadership to change things and the power of positive leadership to change things. And what struck me about your book also is there's a way to look at diversity that also is a business success, a social success that builds better cities, that builds better communities, that builds a better America, that can build more successful companies. And you said, I think in that book, that there are leaders who have found the key, but most are getting their butt kicked. Why are we failing to lead, even if the intent is shifting or has shifted on the part of many?
When you're a transformative leader, you will have detractors, opponents, naysayers. You may have to deal with active countermeasures that are being taken when you're a transformative leader. And when you're a transformative leader on issues of inclusion and diversity, you will step on some toes because you'll step on established convention. You'll step on established tradition from time to time. So you've got to be tough enough, have skin thick enough, have the right moral compass and the right emotional balance to be able to lead in an environment of distraction and detraction. And that's what transformative leaders understand how to do. And effective transformative leaders know how to do it. They know how to fight, but they know when to fight. And they don't fight every bumblebee or every mosquito that's on their arm, or every fly that flies and buzzes in their ear. They don't try to use a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. They're much more careful and they're much more selective and they're much more strategic because they understand a larger goal. And the fundamental for people that lead institutions, if you don't fundamentally believe that there is talent everywhere, if you don't fundamentally understand that people from all ethnic groups have made contributions to the greater good of this nation or the greater good of the world, inventors, creators, scientists, leaders, artists, artisans, musicians, you've got to start from a point where you understand that there's human capital of value, talent everywhere when you lead an institution. And will you affirm it? Will you include it? Will you give rise to it? And part of structural racism has been a notion that, quote unquote, it's applied to women and people who are African American people, that they're not as qualified, they're not as ready. They can't handle the situation, right? Which is fundamentally a starting point of bias, and so you gotta, a strong leader doesn't buy that narrative. They reject it aggressively. And that becomes the fundamental place where you start.
So, Marc, I've got many questions. We're at the end of the seminar to really draw out your wisdom. One piece of your wisdom is the need for broad coalitions to affect change. And the Urban League has always been bipartisan. I came into this issue through my political mentor, Jack Kemp, who spent as much time in Harlem as he did on Wall Street in really trying to enact change. And if we look at the 1960s, the history of change in America, the civil rights movement, this was a Democratic president united with, the party of Lincoln, Republicans, to push through all of that legislation. How do we ensure and how do we move to make sure that this coalition at this time is bipartisan and ideas for transformation? As you know, there's different approaches to transformation. You can look at tax credits, greenlining, transformation, ownership, all of these structural pieces that make it very hard for small business owners. And you've focused a lot on jobs and businesses and how to be successful. What are your thoughts on this? Because it seems that we're getting divided over this issue.
I'm glad you mentioned Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp was unique. Jack Kemp obviously was a football player. Jack Kemp was president of the AFL Players Association. And in 1965, the American Football League's All-Star game was to be played in New Orleans. And several African-American players came to New Orleans. And this is a year after the Civil Rights Act of 64. And they were denied service at one of the city's prominent hotels or restaurants. Those players decided that they were going to not play in the game and not boycott the game. And Jack Kemp sided with those players. After city fathers at the time sought to apologize and ensure that those who did that were outliers and didn't represent the broader community. And I think Jack Kemp had uniquely exposure to African-American players long before his political career began. And that was a unique element of Jack Kemp. So Jack, and I knew Jack and had great respect for Jack, had an ease in talking to people and dealing with people across a lot of lines. He didn't see the barrier first, he saw the opportunity first. And that's what made Jack, unique. And so Jack sought to deploy his business-focused orientation towards, urban economic development. And it was the Enterprise Zone program, which he and I think Congressman from New York, including Charlie Rangel, introduced legislation. So he was unique. Bipartisanship is much more elusive in these times, just much more difficult. It requires sometimes the willingness to run against the grain a little bit, but it takes two to tango. We worked on the First Step Act, which ended up being a bipartisan opportunity, one of the rare bipartisan opportunities to pass, a modicum of criminal justice reform. And it took, Hakeem Jeffries and Doug Collins, and I was working on the outside with people like Van Jones, and it took Jared Kushner, quite candidly, pushing on the inside. And it was a unique moment to be able to get something like that done at that point in time. And some people criticize it in that it wasn't enough. And I never said that it was enough, but that it was what it was called, and that is the First Step Back, and much more needs to be done. It is much more difficult in these times to achieve bipartisanship. And I think one of the reasons in the political sense, now, I believe that if we don't get trapped in the world of just Washington politics, and we think outside, and we think about the ability of business leaders to work with advocates for the African American and Latino communities, for example. Or we look at the ability of non-governmental leaders across various, sort of leanings to get together. You can still build some consensus. And maybe as the First Step Act demonstrated, the consensus around the First Step Act began in the Obama years when progressive interests and some conservative interests led by Cato and others, Heritage and the Koch, began to meet and talk and have conversations about making progress. And so it's elusive and it's difficult, but it may require the people and the non-political leaders, or the leaders who are not sitting in politics, to bond before the leaders inside will bond. But
Mark,
we may be on the cusp of a time when people are going to want, because we're in such a tough spot in the country. We have great challenges in the country. And I think when we have great challenges, people become extremely serious. They don't want any foolishness. They're apt for gamesmanship, and posturing isn't the same.
yeah. As you have an audience today, we have an audience of more than 1,000 leaders from business. The diversity leaders, the C-suite leaders in this diversity leadership forum that has been going on for more than a decade. This year, we're really looking at merging the issues that are faced by all people who have had less opportunity, less access, who haven't had those tracks. What would you say to the business leaders today are the three most important things to be sure they're doing right now to motivate their employees? And I saw what you did at the protests that I attended. Young people of great diversity, the vast majority peaceful, wanting to be part of building a better America. And so for these companies, I think it's important to send a signal of leadership. What would you say are the most important things to be done?
I'd say, so I've said this to a number of business leaders that I've had the opportunity to speak to. And I just spoke to the leadership at CNBC about 45 minutes ago. The most important thing, I think, is to look inward. You lead an institution. As a leader of a business institution, you hire a lot of people. You make economic decisions about who you do business with. You select people to serve on your board. You empower many, many, many people. Is the universe that you're empowering racially and ethnically diverse? Is it diverse by gender? Inside, do you have a coherent, effective plan to increase year over year your company's diversity in hiring, in promotions, in procurement, in philanthropy, and fundamental business elements and operations? Do you, or is it sort of, you got a person who you say go make some diverse things happen? Do you treat diversity the way you treat any other initiative you really want to get results on? You want to get results from? That is, do you have a plan? Do you put somebody in charge of it? Do you resource it? And then do you measure it? And do you hold people accountable to get it done? And I think we just passed a milestone in America, I think in the last month or so, and that is that Americans 16 years old and under are now half and half white and half non-white. So for business leaders in America, I say doing these sorts of things, connecting with diversity, is not only the right thing to do as a leader in the 21st century. Your customer base is going to change and evolve dramatically. The pool of employees that you rely on to power your company will change and evolve dramatically. Are you investing in that future? Are you serious about investing in that future? Or do you have sort of a blind eye to it? or you don't really see it as it evolves. Uh, the key to being a
Mark,
good leader is the ability to look over the horizon.
Yeah. One of the things that your wife said in the essay, talking about her life in South Central LA and the transformational moments and the painful moments, is that Black people want to change the way they're perceived. So when we talk about unconscious bias, there's something coming out, and I mentioned at the opening of this conference, there's a very typical conversation that happens, and it goes something like this. I feel hurt by what you've done or what you said or how you viewed me or how you excluded me. And a person in power says, or a friend or someone, I'm not a racist. I didn't mean anything. My heart's in the right place. And then it kind of, this uncomfortable conversation stops. And we've been working at Asia Society to say, how do we stay with this conversation to be able to listen to what that issue is? Could you articulate a bit?
Yeah.
What is the piece of it?
Here's where you need to start. Racism doesn't simply function on an individual basis, but it can function on an individual basis. And a open-minded, progressive person who's not a bigot function and benefit from a let's call it a racist system or a set of a set of systems which favors them. When I finished law school, I joined a major law firm in New Orleans. Now, I'd gone to Penn, an Ivy League school, attended Georgetown University, a top law school in the country. And sometimes, you had a percent of people looked at you and said, the only reason why you went to those schools is because of affirmative action. And it was not uncommon, because I was from New Orleans, for people to automatically presume, if they met me and I was a lawyer, that I had gone to the historically African American law school in Louisiana and the historically African American high school in New Orleans. They just automatically assumed, right, without even a thought that no, I didn't attend either of those schools. In fact, I attended Jesuit High School, which happened to be the #1 rated school in the state, right? And I happened to go to an Ivy League school and a top flight law school. I mean, you sort of sometimes figure, why do I have to confront these perceptions? And not that it was a negative perception, it was simply a perception that was inaccurate because no one would bother to even ask, right? You go to law school. Where'd you go to high school? What undergraduate school did you go to? And you didn't sense it as your white colleagues, where people say, oh, didn't you go to LSU, or didn't you go to, you sense that it was a differential in perception. And so, that's where you become marginalized, right? You become marginalized.
So how do we get better at this? How do we?
It takes people have to learn to check their stereotypes at the door a little bit. They have to check it at the door, and work to be more aware. And I think that institutions can help people confront their unconscious bias. And so, unconscious bias can work against women, African Americans, Latinos, right? Asian Americans, right? No question. My Asian classmate, the perception was that he was a great student in science when he was a brilliant writer, right? So it's like you stereotyped that this is where you fit without respecting him or understanding. And those things are not, it's people say, why would you be insulted by that? Because you didn't give me a chance to state who I was or state what my interest is. It takes a lot of work in order to do that. And you see, I believe that, but importantly, thinking about all these things is important. But I'll say to business leaders, double down on your hiring. A more diverse workforce helps people learn because people are human and they build relationships. Double down on your hiring. If you have African American employees, ensure that they are being treated fairly when it comes to opportunities, when it comes to promotions, when it comes to upward mobility within your company. I think business leaders can have a role externally with their voice, which is, I think, valuable and important, but they can have a true impact by how you hire. And the question for a company is, if I met a business leader today and I said, what are you going to do? How are you going to, and I said, where do you want to be 5 years from now? Let's pencil in 5 years from now. And let me see if in that 5 year period, you've made dramatic shifts. Let me give you an example. This is an example. In 2000,
So, Marc,
yeah. Go ahead.
we're running out of time, but finish with this thought.
Wow.
And
I was going to say, in 2000, in the United States, Fortune 500s, there were 2 women CEOs. 2001, today they're 38. In 2000, 2001, 2, there were 4 African American CEOs. Today there are 4. What that shows you is the arc of possibility to bring about change is there if there's intention.
well, Marc, we have enjoyed very much partnering with you. The session that we did on May 3rd on racism in the time of COVID, which brought together very uniquely, I think, leaders from the Asian community, the Anti-Defamation League, that brought together you, Van Jones, and others to talk about the common experience of how we change biases, how we deal with this, how we work on these issues. We'll continue this conversation. And we thank you for your inspiring leadership. I will call it that, as Sheryl Sandberg said in the foreword to your book. I mean, this is a warm book. This is a book that inspires us that we can be better as individuals and as companies. So thank you very much. And again, proud to be a lifelong member of the National Urban League and to work with you in the future.
Thank you for leading the Gumbo Coalition. Love the conversation today and continue your great work. And we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And God just bless. To say to the audience and to you, Marc, we have coming up next 2 of the leaders at Asia Society, 2 members of my senior officer team. Tony Jackson, who also was from South Central LA, had a similar experience to your wife, Michelle, when he got on a bus and went to a different school and realized the education he had been experiencing in the ghetto there was nothing like the experience that he was bused to, that there was something called education where you learned and you felt safe in the school and, all of those possibilities. And he's devoted his life to helping young people in inner city schools through his work at Asia Society to be able to be globally competent, ready to compete in a globalized world. And that work has been transformational. He's literally written the book on this and done his PhD work at University of Michigan. So he's up next. And then Tina Zhang is our Vice President of External Affairs. And she has been working across many nations to look at building partnerships that can lift up and do the policy work that can be transformational. So we're proud to have them closing out the session here. And again, Marc, thank you so much. And we're going to bring you back next year. We're not going to let you go.
We'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.